Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Rifbound 101. I guess this is a series now based on your demand and the really kind comments you left on the first video. This time we're going to cover how to tune a deck, which I would view as sort of the part two of how to build a deck. And I'm going to try to answer some of the questions that I got on the previous video throughout this presentation. And then we're going to have two exercises, a little bit less than the first time. I guess before we get started on that, a lot of people were asking me either in the comments or through private messages to just make more of these. So for now, I guess that's going to be the plan. And I'm going to rotate through topics that are either left down below in the questions or that seem relevant to me based on tournament setting or local Nexus Night stuff that's happening, or even card reveals that have started happening for Spirit Forged. So the plan for today is really to talk about three different smaller topics that I think really figure into how to tune cards or to tune your deck with cards. So the first being buckets or packages, depending on which game you come from. In Magic, we mostly call them buckets. In Gwent, we used to call them packages. And then I want to talk about curve, which is a super important topic that I was kind of moving through quickly in the first video, and somebody pointed out I should discuss more in depth, as well as card advantage. And then the final two exercises are going to be to start thinking about how to build a Leona deck. We're not going to build a full one, just like the core of one. And then I want to tune the Viktor aggro deck, which wasn't so much aggro in the end as it could have been. So that'll be an interesting exercise to do, and I wonder how people will feel about. So buckets really refers to packages of cards that you have to put into your deck for it to accomplish some kind of function. So moving with the Leona example, that's going to be cards that stun or want to see you stun or reward you for doing that. And so that's kind of a bucket of cards. And usually in the 40 card deck that you're composing, one of those cards is your selected champion, but the other 39 are open to as many buckets as you would like. Now, if you've played Magic the Gathering and Commander specifically, you might know that out of a 100 card deck, there's usually 64 cards that are non-lands, and that makes about 8 buckets of 8 cards, which are like functional, subgroups of cards that accomplish certain things. I think one of the good ways to approach it here would be in packages of 6. And if you want to increase the sort of prevalence of your packages inside of your deck, you can probably move towards 12. And we can talk about what that will look like. Buckets themselves can be anything from mechanics to certain tags, once that will become relevant, to units that have certain energy costs to fulfill that function. And the proportion that you want of them in the deck is largely going to influence how strongly you're committing to a certain strategy. So for example, having a little bit of unit removal doesn't really commit you to a unit removal deck, but it will function as a package that accomplishes a specific task. But if you're playing 12 or 18 pieces of removal, we're having a different discussion. And the sort of third part of this or sub discussion is going to be the interaction between parts of that bucket of cards that you're including. So the Leona example I really like because it's a really well-defined mechanic. So you're going to have sort of your core, which is going to be your legend. And in this case, Leona Radiant Dawn reads, when you stun one or more enemy units, you buff a friendly unit. So this means three things. You want to be stunning units, you want to have units to buff, and you want things that are going to reward you for either stunning units or buffing your units. Now, very easily, Leona doesn't provide an input. She doesn't stun herself. So what you're going to need are cards like Rune Prison, which do it for you. And Solari Chief is another card that can function as input, but it will also function as output because it reads, if it is stunned, kill it, right? So when it would stun an enemy unit, if you've already applied a stun, you're going to get some extra value. Now, there's some discussion about like whether or not stun is good as a mechanic in the meta, which I think really deserves its own like Leona video. I don't think it's quite as bad as the Shanghai National Tournament would lead users to believe. But you know, I digress. And the fourth sort of aspect of a bucket is a multiplier, which will be something that rewards you on top of the output that you're already using. So for example, if you play Rune Prison, you stun a unit, you then play Solari Chief, which will kill the unit, and if you had Solari Shrine set up, you will be further rewarded for killing a stunned unit by getting to draw. Now, you might notice I tend to kind of view these in order of how many you should have in your deck. So you should always have more inputs than you do outputs, because drawing outputs without inputs does nothing, but inputs will give you some amount of value in the sort of regular play. And stun doesn't outright kill units, it just means that they don't deal damage, but it allows you to interact in certain board spaces that otherwise you wouldn't be able to. And likewise, multipliers should not feature as prominently as outputs and much less than inputs in your deck, because drawing a Solari Shrine, if you don't have a Rune Prison and if you don't have something like Solari Chief or units that can kill, does absolutely nothing. It's a dead card. So that's kind of the concept of buckets. And inside of a 40 card deck, and one of the reasons why I do think Leona is difficult to play, is you're going to require some amount of deck real estate dedicated to each one of these, right? You're going to have probably like a 6 to 10 bucket of inputs, a probably like 6 to 8 bucket of outputs, and maybe 4 multipliers. And there are some very crucial cards that Leona wants, like her signature spell, which aren't easy to get if you're, investing in the game at the early stages. Now, the other concept that I want to talk about next, which I think is relevant for, discussing packages and buckets, is the mana curve. And the mana curve is something, or I guess in this game we would call it the energy curve, is something that I brought up loosely in my last video in terms of getting cards that you want to fit into what that curve is. So there are two aspects to kind of thinking through a mana curve. I need to stop. Energy curve. One is the resources, so the energy that you're getting and how much of it you get in the game, and how much of it are you, recycling into your deck. So you're getting 2 new runes a turn, and domains like body, the orange domain, will get access to more. And certain circumstances, yellow can also get access to more exhausted runes and so on. But they are a precious resource, and if you are proceeding on the assumption that you're getting 2 a turn, that will tell you that something like a 2 energy unit or a 3 energy unit, if you're playing second, is a first round unit. A 4 and a 5 are sort of second round units, and beyond that it gets more complicated if, for example, you're using spells that recycle runes back into your deck. And part of figuring out how you want to deal with that curve is figuring out buckets of cards that fit at certain points in your curve, if not in your strategy. The curve is really an old concept in card games that comes from Jay Schneider, who was one of the sort of pioneers of red aggressive decks in Magic. If you want to learn more about that, I highly recommend Ristic Studies' Red Deck Wins video. Sam does a fantastic job of sort of highlighting the conceptual history of thinking through the curve and how to play with it and how to optimize it, which informed my video a lot. And Sam's a fantastic guy, so I'll always plug his videos, and I'll leave a link down in the description below. And sort of the idea that Jay Schneider had was, well, what if I could map the amount of resources that I get in a game as sort of a slope, and then I would fit the amount of cards under that slope. So evidently, it's much easier to get 2 runes than it is to get 6. So you're going to have like more cards that are playing at that energy point if you are playing a proactive deck than if you're playing a more reactive one. So if you're playing aggro, you tend to favor mana curves, energy curves that are very heavy at the 2 to 3 to 4 energy range. Whereas if you're playing control decks, you can really thin down on that, and you're going to have cards that are sort of leaning heavier on the 6+ energy costs, and combo will look for its own pieces, and mid-range will look for sort of intermediate cards that fit in there. And the purpose of thinking through a curve while you're deck building and while you're tuning is to understand how to map those resources and especially how to match sort of your curve to your game plan and understand that the curve is sort of a tool, but you don't always have to adhere to it strongly. I'm going to talk about some cases where you don't need to do that. Take, for example, the Shanghai National highest placing Viktor deck. So this is the top placing deck for day 2 at the most recent national level tournament. And based on sort of the version that we were mocking up a couple of days ago, this deck leans somewhat earlier in terms of units, but it doesn't run cards like Ravenbloom Student, for example, which are like hyper aggressive cards. So you could say that this is sort of a mid-range Viktor list. It leans on a lot of 5-cost spells, on the Machine Evangel at 5, and especially cards like Grand Stratagem and Riptide Rex, and even Thousand-Tailed Watcher, which I don't think are cards that we would define as aggressive. And you can sort of see it when you map, the energy cost of all of the cards in the deck. So, darker orange for units and a bit lighter orange for spells and yellow for gear. This deck actually doesn't run any gear, so there's none of that. And it does lean heavily with about 14 2-cost cards, but then it sort of has like an attenuated slope in the middle. So it's not like putting all of its eggs in that like 2 to 3 cost basket. So in a lot of card games, we're going to refer to playing on that energy curve as curving out, which means when you have 2 energy, you want to play a 2-cost card. When you have 3, you want to play a 2-cost card and a 1-cost card or a 3-cost card. And then so on and so forth. You want to play, 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on. And the idea with curving out is that you're utilizing all of the resources that are available to you in a very proactive manner. Curving out is something that like aggressive to mid-range decks will care about. Controlling decks will not care about curving out almost at all, because what they're looking for is to produce answers to the threats that are coming in. So they will oftentimes pass with open energy or unexhausted runes, and will only play a minimum amount of defensive units and interactive spells to sort of keep you off of points. And so if you're playing sort of that Viktor strategy, you really are playing for the sort of, very linear, 1, 2, 3 sort of game plan. I should also note that Viktor's legend ability is like a 1 energy ability. So no matter what happens, Viktor can fill odd points in your curve. So for example, if you play first and you have absolutely no playable cards, you can still produce a 1 might recruit. If you have a 2-cost card in your first, you can play that. If you're second and you have a 3-cost unit, you can play that, or you can play a 2-cost unit and his ability. So Viktor does a really good job of sort of smoothing out how you curve, but that might not be as aggressive as you can be. And I want to point to this list for the sort of baited hook Darius Hand of Noxus build. So you might have seen this going around. The core of this deck is really the baited hook card, which lets you sacrifice your own units to look at the top 5 cards of your deck and to pull out a unit with equal amounts of power. And what this deck is doing is it is compressing an enormous amount of early turn plays to snowball into additional amounts of aggression. And what you're going to see when we turn to the mana curve is that it hyper favors 2-cost cards. The one thing that this deck wants more than anything else is to have an opening play at all costs. So it runs about 19 different playable cards, 14 of which are units, 2 of which are gear, the sun discs. And then what you want is to sort of pick up your baited hook, which you're aggressively mulliganing for. But even if you don't find it, you are an aggressive deck first and foremost. And you might look at this and say, well, that's very weird. This is an aggressive deck that has a 6-cost, like 2 6-cost cards and 3 8-cost cards. How can I play for those? Well, baited hook actually doesn't need you to get to 6 or 8 mana. And Darius, and especially this style of Darius, will really conform to what Shanghai casters have been calling a low econ playstyle, which you see in like set decks. Um, this means that you are happy playing, for example, with 4 to 5 energy, and then basically never going above that under any circumstance, and really recycling your runes aggressively with Baited Hook. Notably, the version that placed highest at Shanghai didn't use any of the seals, which also help with mitigating this cost, as those are dead drops in terms of aggression. And the other aspect of this to sort of take into account is that Darius himself produces energy to help your curve early on. So instead of producing units like Viktor, he will just make your units hit the board much faster. So this is something that we might refer to as optimizing curve. And if you're familiar with other card games, you might also know this as burn. So burn strategies will compress all of their game plan into the earliest turns possible, and will sort of accept that the game will either be won very quickly or lost way before they lose on point total or cards. They'll just run out of gas. You might hear casters use words like explosive or unexpected. That's kind of what we're talking about here. And so this is sort of like the most extreme end of something like tempo, where you are just absolutely sacrificing any amount of value to just go as fast as possible. Now, if you want to build this kind of deck, what you should be using is something like a hypergeometric calculator. And when we get to the Viktor tuning, I'm going to show you what that is. This is a calculator that you can find online. I really like the Aether Hub one, and it lets you calculate the probabilities of drawing certain cards on certain turns. You don't need to use it all of the time, but what I can tell you is if you absolutely want to draw a 2-cost unit, somewhere between 10 and 14 is where I would want to land. 10 being a bit more risky, 14 being like way safe. And you're drawing 4 cards initially, mulliganing 2, and you're drawing an additional 1 on your first turn. So you're going to have somewhere in the low 90% to draw a 2-cost unit during those circumstances. And if you're playing Darius, that's great because your 2-cost play is practically guaranteed. And if you draw 2 2-cost units and you go second, you can actually play 1, have an additional rune open, and then use Darius's ability to play a second unit and immediately have like a very domineering board state. Now, the sort of inverse to talking about curving out and especially compressing your energy curve as much as possible, is talking about card advantage. And some of the earliest, I think, thorough articles about this, if you want to read up, are from Ted Knudsen around 2006, really talking about Magic. And he's sort of the person that I learned how to think through card advantage when I was a teenager, and trying to understand Magic a bit more. And the objective of talking about card advantage is to think through how many cards you have in your hand and what the function is for that. So card advantage, roughly is a concept that refers to the relative, glut of resources, cards, energy, and runes that you have relative to your opponents, especially cards. And certain things will be worth an amount of card, which we can talk about. But the idea is that if you are not playing a very aggressive style of play, producing card advantage is usually how you're going to win the game. And you can do that in a number of ways, either by making yourself draw. So something like Garen Might of Demacia, which I don't think is a good deck, but showcases the concept. Or something just much more straightforward like Consult the Past, which is being played a lot. I think it's a very stock card advantage spells. So the ways that you can produce card advantage is generally you can make it yourself, so you can generate it yourself, and something like Consult the Past will do that for you, or you can find it on the board. So you can create it by producing a differential between how many cards you have and how many cards your opponent has. Take something like Voidseeker. So Voidseeker deals 4 damage to a unit at a battlefield, and it draws you 1. Now, if it only dealt 4 damage to a unit at a battlefield, it would effectively trade for that unit. So it would produce a 0 deficit or a differential. Because it draws you 1, it automatically does what we call 2-for-1ing your opponent. It will kill his card and it will produce a card for you. Something like Falling Star does that as well because it can hit up to 2 units, which will 2-for-1 the opponent. You won't have drawn a card, but you will have paid 1 card for 2 of your opponent's cards. Or, and this is partly why Falling Star is such a popular card, you can just put both of those 3 damage pings into 1 unit and turn it into a trade for something higher. Generally, if you are an aggressive deck, forcing trades is part of the game. What you want to do is effectively eke out small advantages and really push for pressure, while also making your opponents commit cards in disadvantageous ways. If you're a control deck, what you want to do is you want to 2-for-1 your opponent. Often, when we're having discussions about card advantage versus resource compression, you can talk about the fact that controlling strategies tend to lose the game once their life total, or in this case, the point total, hits the end of the game. And they really only exist in that differential, right? So like the joke would be there are 2 binary states of being for a control deck, which is everything from 0 to 7 points and then 8 points. And everything from 0 to 7 doesn't matter, and 8 is really the point that matters. Whereas aggressive strategies will sort of consider the inverse, and they'll say, well, I actually lose when I run out of cards because I won't be able to accrue card advantage in any way. Now, the reason why I'm harping on this so much is card advantage is often understood to be sort of the be-all, end-all of how to win card games. The more of it you produce, the more likely you are to win. And I think that's generally true if you're a controlling player. But there are players, crazy players like me, who really love playing aggressive decks, where compression and abandoning card advantage for extreme amounts of early tempo can win you the game. You can sort of steal it from under your opponent. So a good example of this is if I'm playing, 2 buckets worth of 2-drop units in a 40 card deck, I have a 96.5% chance of hitting at least one of those cards on my opening hand, and maybe even 2 depending on how my deck looks. And the more units we'll be getting in the game, the more likely it will be that we will have optimal turn 1 plays and maybe even some 1-cost units. And there are some sort of edge cases that I think really stretch the imagination, where the units that you would want to pack into a deck that is sort of like agnostic to the curve is also the kind of unit that you would want to play in a more controlling shell. Kaisa Survivor, I think, is the sort of peak example of this. A 4-mite unit that costs 4, so playable on turn 2 under most circumstances. And when it conquers, it also draws you a card. So it kind of does everything that you want on both ends. You can play it as part of a more controlling package or as part of a more aggressive package. And there's really no downside. That's why the card is so expensive, and partly why Kaisa is so dominant too. Okay, so that's a fair amount of information. And what I want to do is I really want to take a couple minutes to build with buckets. So to think about what that looks like. So we're just going to swap over. So we're working with a Leona shell today. And what I want to do is I really want to think through how you can build the core of a Leona shell, even if it won't be a complete deck. So one of the things, obviously, that you're going to be interested in is cards that stun. And Leona wants to fight for board because you need units that stun. And so automatically, all the units that stun or care about seeing things get stunned are worth a lot of equity in this deck. So Solari Shieldbearer, Solari Chief, and Eclipse Herald. This sort of dictates what mana points your deck is already interested in, because you have a 3, a 5, and a 7. You also want, most evidently, a triple dose of Leona Determined, a unit that when it attacks, it stuns. And so these are going to be sort of like your enablers. So we have 12 cards that are dedicated to the stun package. I'm for this exercise, I'm actually not going to consider budget, but I will tell you that Zenith Blade is crazy expensive for what it does. I would just play 3 of these. Zenith Blade is one of the sort of 2-for-1ing cards by default because it stuns and it moves your units. So you can do some pretty crazy plays and get a lot of value out of it. But it's not as essential as the units, for example. And then I personally think that I would play 2 Leona Zealots. I do want to draw them, and they are actually like very strong payoffs. I know most tournament lists I've seen only play 1. I think if we're, just really trying to get into the vibe of having some payoffs, I would play like all of them, or 2 of them at least. Triple Rune Prison, most certainly for this kind of deck. And then 2 Solari Shrine, which are probably going to be your only like multiplier payoffs. Now, what's also happening in this deck is you are buffing a lot of your units. And so the other half of this that you can look at, and I'll come back to Facebreaker in a second, is instead of looking for stun, you can look at cards that care about buff. And Spirit's Refuge, I think, is sort of a fantastic card that you can put into your deck to really stymie Kaisa decks that are running a ton of removal. So we'll put 1, but I don't know if I would want more than that. Primarily, Spirit's Refuge is going to cost 2. It is a gear, so it sticks on the board, and it will give 1 buff, and it will have the clause, friendly buffed units have deflect. So opponents need to burn runes to target them, and if they're playing something like Void Seeker or Falling Star, they might need to burn 1 to 2 runes, and if they're playing Icathian Rain or Icathian Rain, they're going to have to burn up to 6 runes to even be able to target one of your big units. So Spirit's Refuge, kind of fantastic. Then Set is sort of a good 2-drop that you can have in this deck. Gets +1 for each buffed friendly unit at his battlefield, and he can tank. He can be buffed himself, or he can see other buffs and, utilize that kind of equity as much as possible. And then the other unit that I have in mind that I think is really important for Leona is Fiora. Fiora is not necessarily a unit that says buff or stun, but what it does say is when I'm mighty, I gain deflect, ganking, and shield. And mighty refers to having 5 might or more, which Leona will give on basically every stun. So at this point, you have about 23 cards plus the 5 champions. You're at 28 cards. And you have to devote a significant amount of your deck to these cards. Otherwise, the stun strategy and the buff strategy won't function very well. Now, looking at this, it's also pretty clear that you have to stun after you've played units. And so having Rune Prison, or having Solari Shieldbearer this far out is actually a bit risky. You want some 2-drop units that you can reliably play. So, we're going to sort of start thinking of 2-cost units that you can play readily that will wear buffs very well. And I would personally say Stalwart Poro is most definitely on that sort of train. And then I would also play Daring Poro for the same reason. And now something interesting happens. You're running a high amount of Poros, 6 of them, that are in the 2 colors that you're privileging. And also, it lets you run Poro Herder, which is hidden somewhere from me. There we go. So Poro Herder reads, when you play me, if you control a Poro, buff me and draw 1. Hey, look at that. We like buffs, and we need some card advantage. We need to draw some more cards, but you're only playing 6 Poros, so I wouldn't play more than 2 Poro Herder. You really only want to draw maybe 1 a game. So you're at 36 cards. And my last two, like, very quick picks, 36 cards, would be two Defies as sort of counter magic to prevent your opponent from going over you. And then because you're such a fighty deck, you do privilege sort of on the board interaction, and you want something that is cheap. I'm a big fan of On Guard, 2 copies of. Obviously, this is a very quick sort of approach to how to build a Leona deck, and I think devoting like a half-hour video to talking about what Leona wants and how it works and the speeds that it can play will work a lot better than just jamming together this deck. But this should give you an idea of how your deck can wear, like a Leona skin, but it will in fact be a certain number of buckets relating to stun and stun outputs, a certain amount of buffs, and a certain amount of poros. You could remove the poros if you want and really go for a Soaring Scout Clockwork Keeper style start, which will allow you to take battlefields a bit quicker. I tend to like this one, which is a bit more defensive and will make use of your beefy units. But like most mid-range decks, this deck is going to fall over to Aurora, which I think is it really is its problem, is that it has, depending on the speed you're playing, it has some pretty tough matchups in the meta. If I remember correctly, the Shanghai National list that were fielded lean a bit more on cards like White Flame Protector, which is out of my sort of bracket right now. And the reason why I'm not even discussing that deck right now is because White Flame Protector is sort of like an $85 card, which is ridiculous. And especially if you want to play something at that price range, I would recommend decks that are dominant. If you want to play Leona, I would recommend sort of feeling your way through it and then picking versions of the deck that you feel work a bit better. One of the cards that is also good, but a bit out of this sort of early budget, is Divine Judgment, which will just demolish control decks by resetting them to 2 runes. And you can keep, 2 of your big units, and they will struggle to recapitalize. I think its actual worst matchup, however, is Kai'Sa, and the fact that Kai'Sa is so dominant right now is why Leona is seeing a little bit less play. That will, hopefully change. I don't think that Leona and the stun units are inherently bad. I think they just have like a terrible field that they're being played into. In terms of battlefields, this is sort of a conquer and hold kind of strategy. So you can kind of build it whichever way you would like. I think you're going to have access to a fair number of buffs. So you can play... Oh god. You can play Monastery of Hirana to spend your buffs and draw a little bit more. You can also expend... you can play Dreaming Tree. If you target yourself... actually, it's with spells, and you're not playing... Well... Zenith Blade technically targets you, On Guard targets you. You'd probably want like a more disciplined version of this, but for now it's like fine for what we're talking about. And you probably want a bit more card advantage, and you want to encourage people to trade with you but not stick there, so you can sort of have like on the battlefield skirmishes. So I like Zon Warrens. I'm sure there's like a faster version where you can play with Arena's Greatest, or like a more go-wide version where you play with Trifarian War Camp. There are some discussions to be had for sure. And then runes, as always, just look at your proportion of runes. I'm just going to pick, an even split for today. And this is certainly kind of a... just call it Leona bucket experiment. This is very experimental, and it's really more to illustrate how to approach deck building with buckets. This deck is like €76. I think if you cut the Zenith Blades, this deck drops down like 2/3 of the price. And yeah, you would probably want to run like a 7-5 split actually for calm and order. So that's it for the Leona experiment. And now the last thing I wanted to do was talk about tuning. So I'm going to flip back for a quick second here. Tuning is a process that I think is going to become increasingly important after you're done building the core of your decks, and especially as you sort of take these into the field. Now, you can tune for a variety of reasons. You can assess how you feel the deck is working and to tune it to increase the speed or the value that you're getting from a bunch of cards. But you can also tune it to fit the ecosystem that you're playing in. And a lot of the decks that we've been seeing are really tuned for nationals, where budgets are really not a concern for people, and also where you're seeing wide fields of 2,000 players, which I mentioned in the last video is not enormous, but it's still like a pretty big sample size. And we know now that Kaisa and Yi are dominant in those environments, and so people are going to tune their decks against those. You can tune for your store. Like, if you see a lot of people are playing exclusively aggro decks, you would probably want to tune to deal with them in some way, having a little bit of a slower game plan or something with more board wipes. If you see that everybody is playing control, you can make your deck faster and try to get under them, or to play sort of defensive tools that will cheaply counter what the control players are doing. And sort of the idea is really to mix and match your deck as you go by adjusting, what are the big proportions in it. One of the finer points of tuning is what we call teching. So teching, like the Spirit's Refuge card I added to that Leona shell, is the idea that you will sometimes add one of copies of cards exclusively to deal with certain matchups, and you can have these in the sideboard or the main deck based on what you expect. So what I want to do is I actually want to look at the Viktor deck that we were dealing with the other day, and I got some really interesting comments about the speed of the deck and the idea that what we built was actually more of a mid-range deck. I actually want my deck. And that we could accelerate it further. So one of the comments that we got was actually that the sort of Spectral Matron, Machine Evangel, and Ladros package, especially the Heimerdinger, are cards that are not aggressive enough to suit an aggressive shell. So I'm happy to experiment with this and to cut them out. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut out Heimerdinger, and we're going to cut out 2 of the matrons. We're going to leave 1 because we do run a fair amount of units that I wouldn't be mad recurring, like Watchful Sentry, Daring Poro, and the Faithful Manufacturer. Machine Evangels are out for being a bit too slow, and we can reduce the Commander Ladros. And what we're going to add instead are 3 Ravenbloom students. Now, 2 Might for 2 is sort of baseline, not super exciting, but what you do get with this is the capacity to turn cards like Stupefy into bigger trades. So you're going to love doing that. And Hidden Blade can also trigger it, and you can also still use some Cull the Weeks. This, I think, is much more solid and will push your curve even earlier. I've seen some people play Blastcone Fae instead, and, your mileage may vary on that, but I think that's like a pretty good starting point. And then we're happy to keep Cruel Patron, which is a very sort of aggressive start to like your tempo. And then above that, you're going to notice like there's not a lot of units that we are very excited to play when we're trying to be incredibly assertive. Now, as we mentioned when we were talking about curve a little bit, Viktor effectively has an infinite amount of 0 cost of 1 cost cards. So you want to use things that utilize those recruits, and you also want to just play units that are hyper aggressive to the board and that you're not super fussed with losing. So I'm happy actually playing 3 of Trifarian Glory Seeker. I actually don't like Noxian Drummer that much in practice, And so we already have a salvage, which is a tech card for Aurora and gears, like Baited Hook or the Mask. We're happy with Imperial Decree. Grand Stratagem is fine. Singularity is fine. And so you're kind of looking for a one-of card that you would like seeing. There's some starting to be some Spirit Forge stuff in here that is, I think, not ideal, but listen, it's there. I can't like remove it. So we're at 3. I feel like I had a discussion about this with what to put as like the last slot of this. Oro's already in. Don't really like Soaring Hawk all that much, but I suppose I'm not against playing it either. Huh. Blast Cone Fae is not bad. I think because we have the Raven Blooms, I'm happy to play a Smokescreen, and I'm actually going to reduce. You don't want to hold, you just really want to conquer here. Smokescreen's fine, it's just very efficient. Listen, there's probably better ways to tech it, but this looks somewhat better to me if you're really trying to be assertive. And now I think sort of the crazy amount of yellow runes that were loaded up in the Ladros and the multiple spectral matrons is kind of gone. Yeah, you're thinking about Smokescreen as like a proactive spell. Yeah, listen, I think this is okay. And now really what you're going to be doing is just trying to get on board and to conquer as much as possible. The other thing that I think maybe I was a bit too gung-ho on was Altar to Unity, just because it was reading recruits. But what you would like in this case, I think, because we already have Trifarian War Camp and Arena's Greatest, which are like very good for aggro strats, and you are somewhat spell, centric, but you don't care that much, I think is going to be to put in Zon Warren, which I generally like. And then, you're on like version 2. So just call this like a work in progress. And we're going to keep teching this over the next couple of videos until we hit like a consensus point, I think, of what feels like a very good, cheap Viktor deck. This deck is now like crazy cheap. I think you could probably play this and feel reasonably well at like a small local event. And then there are obviously like power cards, which I'm really not putting in here, like Thousand-Tailed Watcher, which is exceptionally strong. But if you have one, you could definitely throw it in here instead of the Smokescreen. And now what we can look at, for example, is you would like to play a unit on turn 1. We have 3, 6, 9, 12, 15 2-cost units. And I'm going to open the hypergeometric calculator. And here's how it works, right? So your deck has a population of 40. That's the size of your deck. It actually has a population of 39 because you don't draw that 40th card, which is your champion. And your sample size is always going to be 7 cards to start with because you have 4 cards, 2 in the mulligan, and 1 in the draw. And you have 15 hits, and you want to draw 1 of them, which is a 97.7% chance. Effectively, you will not draw a unit in your opening hand once in every, like 1 out of 10, 1 out of 40 games, if my math is in. And then let's say you want to have that double play. Actually, that's more relevant for Darius, but if let's say we were doing this math with a Darius and you have that Legion calculator, you would still be favored at 84.6% to draw 2 units for Darius. But realistically, because you only need 1 with Viktor, and your 3rd mana is always going to producing a unit, you kind of have like an ironclad first turn. Like you will always be on board, and whether you're first or second, you're going to be able to either immediately conquer both fields or at least one of them and then contest for the other. Again, I'm sure there's discussions to have about these, and I'm happy to take more comments. Oh, this is the old version. I'm happy to take some comments about this and see what to cut. We're like getting a bit lighter on the token units, so maybe we don't need. No, I still like Call the Week. You're in Viktor. Anyways, that's kind of it for the tuning aspect, and I think that's going to wrap it up for today. The last part of this that I want to talk about super quickly is going to be plans for the next episode, which is probably going to come out next Monday if my schedule stays consistent between other work commitments. And what I'd like to do is sort of do a mock how to build a deck from a fresh collection. So we're going to be using an online portal that allows you to sort of like open packs to consider what cards you're getting. And we're going to open, say, like half a box, which I think is somewhat generous given how much product is flowing. But that should give you sort of an idea of how you can start building from a fresh collection. And obviously there's going to be some variation, but I think that would be a cool experiment. So until then, I hope that you enjoyed this video, and feel free to subscribe to keep getting updates from me. And if you have any questions, leave them below, and I'll do my best to answer in the meantime. Thank you so much for, sticking it out this long and for watching the videos so far. Bye.